as you know, the House passed, what was it, HB 51, is it? HR 51?
Yes.
HR 51 is the House resolution to grant statehood to Washington, D.C. We have how many 100,000 people there?
700,000
700, yeah, 700,000 people in Washington, D.C., the size of many states. And there's no representation, or at least no voting representation. And how does Ben Shapiro deal with that concept? Well, if you want representation with your taxation, just move. The concept of having federal land cordoned off from local land is not a new concept. We have federal state parks. We have federal parks. We have federal courthouses. We have federal buildings. And when you're on that federal building, you're on federal land. We have this. We actually do this in like foreign countries even. You have an embassy. Like, this concept is not so mind-blowing, but apparently it is for Ben Shapiro as he discusses the horrors of providing representation to those that we tax in the 700,000 person populated Washington, D.C. Like I say, almost as well, we have multiple states that are that size. Here, Matt, why don't you play it?
So constitutionally speaking, there has to be a federal district. That federal district has historically been Washington, D.C. And there are lots of people who live within Washington, D.C. So what Democrats are trying to do now is they've passed a bill. It passed 216 to 210, with all the Democrats voting in favor and all the Republicans voting against. And that bill basically would take the area that is directly outside of the federal buildings, and then it would carve it off and call it its own state. Now, that's perfectly ridiculous. It's perfectly ridiculous because if you wanted that area to be incorporated into a state, you could totally do that. I have a counter proposal. Why don't we just take those areas and we will then encompass them in either Virginia or Maryland? Simple. Done. Now you have senators. Congratulations.
The people don't want that, I think, would be one good answer to that. Like, nobody wants that.
He wants no one residing in Washington, D.C.?
No, what he wants is to not make D.C. a state. He wants to have it subsumed into other states. You know, while we're at it, do we really need a South and North Dakota, with all due respect, Matt? I mean, come on.
Well, that was purely partisan decision by the Republican Party, to the point where like all the counties in those states are named after just like land commissioners and stuff that were in the party at the time.
What about North and South Carolina? Do we really need two Carolinas? Why? I mean, when you talk about the difference between Washington, D.C. and, Virginia and Maryland. I mean, I don't know. I mean, do we really, how about we make every state in the country should be the same size as either New York or California or Texas? We just combine them.
Yeah. I mean, he constantly talking about what the founders intended and, what the Constitution says. So no taxation without representation is kind of a fundamental founding principle for America. Would you say, Sam?
Of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, he might want to check if he really loves the Constitution or not.
Do we have more? Yeah, play more.
Congratulations. But no, Democrats want the people of Washington, D.C. to have their own senator. In fact, why don't they do this everywhere? They should probably just say Chicago. It really isn't like the rest of Illinois. So Chicago is going to be its own state with its own senators now. California has so many different areas. Why don't we just make L.A. its
own? Pause
own?
it for 1 second. I want to remind you that the difference between Chicago and the rest of Illinois is that Chicago has representation right now. They have voting representation in both the House and the Senate. Washington, D.C. has none. That's the difference. They have none.
Yeah, well, besides that, you know.
Besides that, it's almost the same.
Actual state. Okay, that's exactly what they're doing. They're basically saying, okay, we don't have to change the Constitution so long as we leave these federal buildings in their own federal district. But all the people who are living in that surrounding area, who've been living there for, generations, all of those people are now going to have their own state as opposed to being encompassed in Maryland or Virginia. Again, the Washington, D.C. district was designed specifically to be a federal district. If you don't want to live in a place that doesn't have senators, fare thee well. Virginia is just across that river and Maryland is just a little bit the other way. But that's not what Democrats are doing. And they have a rationale for why you must not oppose them. Wait for it. It's because you're racist. You see that one coming? You didn't see it coming, did you? The whole reason they say that Washington, D.C. exists as a place with no senators is because of racism. Now, that's absurd on its face. It's ridiculous. Washington, D.C. was established when black people weren't even allowed to vote anywhere in the United States, essentially. So racism obviously was not the deciding factor in creating Washington, D.C.
Wait, what?
Yeah, because that terrible rule about black people not voting applied everywhere. So obviously, if you're creating a federal district, it's not about whether black people are going to have senators, because black people at the time couldn't have senators anywhere. So it wasn't about making a racist district where black people couldn't have senators. And now you're trying to retcon the entire story in order to make it an outgrowth of racial animus, but it wasn't.
He kind of disproved his own point there.
Well, I mean, it may be the case that, but I would also suspect that the number of people living in Washington full time was incredibly small. That you didn't have 700,000 people. You didn't have a city that had major issues that the federal government that them having a say in federal policy was relevant, frankly. I mean,
right. It was a town made out of nowhere for the purposes of being a government.
The idea that you wouldn't in any way, like the number of people living there and the nature of the area growing up in such a specific manner would have no bearing on your decision. The question isn't whether they never received voting rights in that district because of racism, is missing the point as to why they're not getting it now.
Exactly. It doesn't matter what the original intent was. Your reason for excluding it now is because you don't want certain people to have representation for basically political reasons.
You know what? There was a bunch of not states when Washington, D.C. was made the capital.
Exactly. And this is kind of the sister argument to when he went viral with that clip about if you live in a coastal zone that could be flooded due to climate change, then what do? You just sell your houses and you move, right? You're going to sell your underwater house to somebody. It's kind of the same argument here. If everyone in DC who wants representation should leave and sell their place, he's
the type of guy who moved across the country to Nashville and now he's walking around in cowboy hats. But that's not the existence that most people can live, where you can, I think I want a senator, so I'm going to change where I live for that reason.
Oh, it's just a purely theoretical argument that's not based in reality. And if it ever were based in reality, it would be entirely like a privileged decision made by somebody and made by two people out of the hundreds of thousands who live in DC.
He's not the first person to do that. Why don't we just make it part of Maryland or Virginia, though? And the answer is because nobody's asking for that. That is the only reason you do that is to solve your problem.
Right. Exactly. I mean, somehow after DC was founded, we were able to create, another 40 some odd, 35 some odd states, 37 states.
And those were made just because they deserve to be made, not for purely political purposes in and of themselves, right, Sam? I mean, the founding.
Well, it wasn't because you needed representation for people. It was because God said there should be we need 37 more states. So get
and
on
on
it,
the seventh
guys.
day, he created South Dakota.
That's right. I mean, why not? Why not get rid of South Dakota? Let's just roll it into one Dakota.
I think where we need to get to is the Democrats just need to act like the Republicans that made 2 Dakotas. Just
Yeah.
do it, right?
Right.
Like we all know
problem
the
is-
history. Just do it.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that you have members of the Democratic caucus who are just not interested at all and in having that power. And then you have others who if they were put in the position of having to, for instance, like Chris Coons, I don't think that he would be, if he was the 50th vote for the filibuster, I don't think he would vote against reforming or getting rid of the filibuster. But I think he's happy as the 42nd vote to like not have the filibuster removed. Let's put it that way. And the problem is that we have a couple of people who are happy to be the 50th vote. And Joe Biden seems now so timid and incapable of pushing on that end. And it's not going to be, it does not portend well to his future.